Hey, church family. If God could work a miracle in your life, what would it be? And are you open to God's work in your life? As we turn to John 9 today, Jesus and his disciples passed by a man who was desperately in need of the work of God in his life. This man had been born blind, and because of his disability, he had been ostracized from his community. Jesus' disciples asked the question that everybody wanted to know the answer to. Was this man born blind because he sinned or because his parents sinned? Jesus answered, saying, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but he was born blind that the works of God might be displayed through him. Then Jesus approached the man, he anointed the man's eyes with mud, and he told the man to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And in that moment, the man who had been born blind had a choice to make. Would he be open to the work of God in his life? This man had probably heard about Jesus. He had probably heard that Jesus was a great teacher. He had probably heard that Jesus had healed others of their sicknesses. But in this moment, he had to decide whether he believed that Jesus would and could heal him. With the belief that he had, the man who had been born blind stood up, walked to the pool of Siloam, washed the mud out of his eyes, and for the first time in his entire life, he could see. He was extremely excited, and he went throughout his entire community sharing with anyone who would listen about God's work in his life. And as he shares with his community, we learn a lesson. That while this man who had been born blind was open to the work of God in his life, many in his community either could not or would not acknowledge God's work. There were those who could not believe it. They could not believe that the eyes of a man born blind could be opened. There were those who were afraid to acknowledge that this was God's work. His own parents feared that they would be kicked out of the synagogue, so they did not acknowledge God's work in their son's life. And then there were those who simply refused to acknowledge that this was God's work. The religious leaders of the day so hated Jesus, they so feared that they were going to lose their power, that they would not acknowledge that this was God's work through Jesus in this man's life. They knew that only God could open the eyes of a man born blind. And they knew that if they acknowledged that this was God's work, that they would also be acknowledging that Jesus was the Messiah. That Jesus had the power to open the eyes of a man born blind, and that Jesus was God in the flesh, revealed as the Messiah. And so they refused to acknowledge God's work. Jesus would say that these men, these religious leaders who claimed to see, were actually blind because they were not open to God's work. We all want a miracle, but are we open to God's work in our lives? As you read through John 9 today, ask God to open your eyes that you might see what He wants you to see.